Guadalcanal ridges establishing shot. In the brutal calculus of war, an army is measured in divisions, in artillery batteries, in tons of supply delivered. Victory is a matter of mass, of firepower, of overwhelming force. But what happens when the calculus fails? When the trajectory of a battle, of an entire campaign, comes to rest not on the shoulders of thousands, but on one? This is not a story of grand strategy in map-lined war rooms. This is a story of a single man, a single mountain, and 3 days that defied all military law. Coghlan with squad studying map, the place, Mount Austin. The date, January 10, 1943. On a jagged, blood-soaked ridge on the island of Guadalcanal, a lone American soldier, Sergeant John Jack Coghlan of the 132nd Infantry Regiment, Americall Division, was about to write one of the most extraordinary, and largely forgotten, chapters of personal heroism in the Pacific War. His orders were simple: hold this position. He would follow those orders to their most absolute, and terrifying, conclusion. Squad digging fighting positions. To understand the sheer impossibility of Sergeant Coghlan's stand, we must first understand the battlefield. By January 1943, the tide on Guadalcanal was turning decisively against the Japanese. The U.S. capture of the critical airfield, Henderson Field, had given the Americans a vital foothold. But the Japanese were not yet defeated. The remnants of the Imperial Japanese Army's 17th Army, though battered and disease-ridden, were desperate. Their final objective, to launch a coordinated, massive counteroffensive to retake the airfield and push the Americans into the sea. Soldiers' hands gripping M1 Garand, the key to the American Western defense was a series of rugged, jungle-choked ridges that formed a natural barrier. Among them was a prominent, unnamed hill that would later be designated Mount Austin. It was a brutal piece of terrain. Steep, muddy slopes, thick with kanai grass and tangled roots, offering perfect concealment for an enemy. The air was thick with humidity and the ever-present stench of decay and cordite. For the men of the 132nd Infantry, it was a hellish, alien environment. Japanese soldiers moving in jungle, and at the center of this maelstrom was Sergeant Jack Coghlan. A 24-year-old from Montana, Coghlan was a natural outdoorsman and a reluctant but highly competent soldier. He wasn't a grizzled veteran of a dozen battles, but he possessed a quiet, unyielding fortitude that his men respected. He was given command of a reinforced squad, tasked with establishing and holding an advanced observation post on the forward slope of Mount Austin. Their mission was critical: to act as the eyes and ears of the battalion, to report any enemy movement, and to blunt the spearhead of the impending Japanese assault. They were the tripwire. Little did they know, they were about to become the entire dam. Soldiers firing from foxholes, the first day passed with a tense, unnerving quiet. The jungle was never silent, but the familiar sounds of birds and insects were now a source of constant anxiety. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, could be the enemy. Coghlan positioned his dozen men carefully, creating overlapping fields of fire with their M1 Garands and a single, precious Browning automatic rifle. They dug shallow fighting positions, the rocky soil fighting them for every inch. Coghlan using field glasses. On the morning of the second day, the silence broke. A patrol from the 3rd Platoon, operating several hundred yards to Coghlan's left, stumbled into a strong Japanese force and was nearly wiped out. The crack of rifle fire and the distinctive BRRRP of the Japanese Type 96 light machine gun echoed through the valleys. Coghlan knew immediately what it meant. The main enemy push was beginning, and his position was directly in its path. Japanese company massing in valley. By 1400 hours, the first probing attacks began. Small groups of Japanese soldiers, skilled in infiltration tactics, began testing the American perimeter. They moved like ghosts through the undergrowth. Coghlan's men, nerves frayed, held their fire until the last possible moment. The sharp report of the M1 Garands was answered by the higher-pitched crack of the Arisaka rifles. The firefight was short, brutal, and costly. 2 of Coghlan's men were hit, 1 fatally. The Japanese melted back into the jungle. Field radio close-up, but this was just the beginning. Through his field glasses, Coghlan saw movement in the valley below. Not just squads, but what appeared to be an entire company, perhaps 150 strong, of the Japanese 228th Infantry Regiment, was massing. They were a mixed force, armed with light machine guns, knee mortars, and the terrifying flamethrowers that had become a hallmark of their assaults. The sheer weight of numbers was staggering. Coughlin's squad now numbered 10 effective fighters. Coughlin addressing his men, he immediately radioed Battalion HQ. The response was grim. Reinforcements were promised, but they were at least 24 hours away. Every other company in the regiment was heavily engaged. Coughlin and his men were on their own. He made a fateful decision. Instead of withdrawing to a more defensible position further up the ridge, a standard tactical move, he chose to stand. He knew that if they gave up this ground, the entire battalion's flank would be exposed. The Japanese could roll up the American line like a carpet. "Banzai, charge up slope, we hold here," he told his men, his voice calm but leaving no room for argument. "We have to." The first major assault came at dawn on the third day. A frontal charge by a full platoon of 50 Japanese soldiers, screaming, "Banzai," as they surged up the slope. Coughlin's men were ready. The bar gunner, Private First Class Miller, cut down the first wave with long, controlled bursts. Miller firing bar, grenades arced through the air, exploding with deafening concussions in the tight ranks of the attackers. The attack was repulsed, leaving 20 enemy dead strewn across the kunai grass. But the cost was high. Miller was killed by a sniper's bullet. Grenade explosion among Japanese, 2 more men were wounded, one screaming as a mortar round shredded his leg. Coughlin's effective force was down to 7. Miller's lifeless hand on bar, the situation was now critical. Ammunition was running dangerously low. The men were exhausted, operating on sheer adrenaline and fear. The stench of blood and death hung heavy in the humid air. Flies swarmed over the bodies of the fallen. Exhausted defenders treating wounded, and then, the unthinkable happened. A well-aimed knee mortar round landed directly in the center of Coughlin's main position. The explosion was cataclysmic. Knee mortar round in flight, when the smoke and dirt cleared, the scene was one of utter devastation. 3 more men were dead. 2 others were grievously wounded, unable to fight. The radio, their only lifeline to command, was shattered into a dozen pieces. Cataclysmic explosion in position, Sergeant Jack Coughlin, bleeding from a shrapnel wound to his arm and temporarily deafened by the blast, was now utterly alone. Of the 12 men he started with, only he and 2 severely wounded soldiers remained, and they were no longer combat effective. He was the last man standing on Mount Austin. Aftermath of explosion, shattered radio, he looked down the slope. The Japanese, sensing the weakness, were regrouping for another, final assault. This time, it was at least 2 platoons, over 100 men. They moved with a renewed confidence, knowing the American resistance had been nearly silenced. Coughlin's bloodied face after blast, for Coughlin, the world seemed to shrink to the few yards of muddy earth in front of him. The weight of command, the lives of his men, the fate of the entire battalion's flank, it all rested on him. Coughlin's POV of wounded soldiers, he was out of communication, outnumbered over 100 to 1, and nearly out of time. The mountain, which had felt so large just days before, now felt like a tiny, exposed island in a sea of enemies. Surrender was not an option, the Japanese offered no quarter. This was the end of the line. Coughlin alone versus army below, but surrender was a word that did not exist in Jack Coughlin's vocabulary. In that moment of absolute crisis, a cold, clear resolve settled over him. He was not going to yield this ground. He would make the Japanese pay for every inch of it with their blood. What happened next was not an act of blind rage, but one of calculated, brilliant, and utterly ruthless battlefield improvisation. Coughlin collecting weapons, his first move was to create the illusion of strength. He began a one-man war of movement. He collected all the remaining weapons and ammunition from his fallen comrades. He now had his M1 Garand, 2 additional rifles, the damaged but still functional bar, several .45 caliber Thompson submachine guns, and a case of hand grenades. He positioned these weapons at different points along the small perimeter. Coghlan firing Thompson, moving. As the Japanese began their final advance, they were met not with the fire of a squad, but with what sounded like a determined, multi-positional defense. Coghlan would fire 3 rapid shots from his Garand from behind one rock, then scramble through a shallow communication trench to a different position, unleash a long burst from the Thompson, then move again to hurl a grenade from a third location. Confused Japanese taking cover, he used the bar in short, devastating bursts to simulate a machine gun nest. To the advancing Japanese, it was incomprehensible. They were not attacking a single, weakened soldier, they were attacking what sounded like a stubborn, well-entrenched pocket of resistance. Coghlan targeting officer through sights. 4 hours, this macabre dance of death continued. Coghlan became a phantom on the mountain. He was everywhere and nowhere. The Japanese, confused and taking casualties from an enemy they could not pinpoint, became cautious. Their advance stalled. Coghlan used their hesitation to his advantage. He targeted their officers and NCOs, the men shouting orders, further disorganizing the attack. He conserved his precious ammunition, firing only when he had a clear target. He used the terrain, the fading light, and the enemy's own confusion as his primary weapons. Japanese closing in at night, the climax came as night began to fall. A group of Japanese soldiers, braver than the rest, managed to close in on his final fighting position. In the close quarters, shadowy fight that followed, Coghlan used his bayonet and his entrenching tool as a club in a desperate, brutal struggle for survival. Close quarters combat with entrenching tool. When it was over, 5 enemy soldiers lay dead around his foxhole. Sergeant Jack Coghlan, bleeding from new wounds, exhausted beyond comprehension, but still standing, had broken the back of the assault. The Japanese, believing they were facing a much larger, fanatical force, withdrew down the mountain under the cover of darkness. The ridge was silent once more, save for the moans of the wounded and the ragged breathing of the last American standing. Close quarters combat with entrenching tool. When it was over, 5 enemy soldiers lay dead around his foxhole. Sergeant Jack Coghlan, bleeding from new wounds, exhausted beyond comprehension, but still standing, had broken the back of the assault. The Japanese, believing they were facing a much larger, fanatical force, withdrew down the mountain under the cover of darkness. The ridge was silent once more, save for the moans of the wounded and the ragged breathing of the last American standing. Relief force arriving at ridge, the strategic impact of Coghlan's one-man stand was immediate and profound. By holding Mount Austin for 3 days against a force of such overwhelming size, he had completely disrupted the timing and focus of the Japanese 228th Regiment's attack. The enemy's main effort was blunted and disorganized, allowing the American battalions to the rear to consolidate their defenses and ultimately repel the larger counteroffensive. The entire Guadalcanal campaign had hinged on a series of such small, brutal actions, and Coghlan's was among the most decisive. Coghlan's face with Medal of Honor text, for his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Sergeant John Jack Coghlan was recommended for and received the Medal of Honor. The citation recounts his virtual one-man defense and his utter disregard for his own personal safety. But the true legacy of Mount Austin is not just in the medal of a medal. It is a testament to the power of the human spirit when pushed to its absolute limit. It is the story of how one man's unbreakable will, his tactical genius under fire, and his profound sense of duty, quite literally, broke an army. The stand on Mount Austin is a stark reminder that in the vast, impersonal machinery of World War, the course of history can sometimes be altered by the actions of a single individual. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.